bit more?
A little bit more, please. Thanks.
From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Monday, April 20th, 2015. An explosive and new investigative report details how World Bank-sponsored projects have displaced millions of people worldwide while claiming to end poverty. We'll speak with the report's lead author, Sasha Shavkin. And Congress has reached a deal to give President Obama fast-track authority on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as NAFTA on steroids. My guest Patrick Woodall of Food and Water Watch will explain what's at stake. Plus, tipped workers are getting left behind in the fight for a higher minimum wage. We'll speak with Sophia Cheng of the Restaurant Opportunity Center. But now we'll turn to Robert Jensen for the news. Robert Jensen is sitting in for Rahul Mahajan. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, less than a week after we reported on about 400 deaths of migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea, another even larger group of people has died under similar circumstances. 700 people were estimated dead on Sunday when a fishing boat capsized off the coast of Libya. That number is inching closer to 1,000 today as European Union officials are scrambling to Luxembourg for an emergency meeting about the crisis. Rather than examining the obvious reasons why so many people are fleeing their countries, i.e. war and poverty, officials are likely to address the illegality of trafficking. British Prime Minister David Cameron said, quote, "We should put the blame squarely with the criminal human traffickers who are the ones managing, promoting and selling this trade in human life. We are doing everything we can to try and stop them." Well, Bob, is it short-sighted to focus only on the traffickers or the coyotes of Europe as it is? Shouldn't officials be addressing the reasons why people are fleeing in the first place?
Well, you're absolutely right. Of course, the traffickers bear responsibility. No one's arguing about that. But David Cameron's comment acknowledges a kind of moral blindness. After all, the question is, why do people risk their lives, knowingly risk their lives, to try and get to a place like Europe or the United States? And the obvious answer is the incredible disparity worldwide in the distribution of wealth. Where did that disparity come from? It's not a product of the global South. It's a product of hundreds of years of policies of the global North, at which the heart, of course, is Great Britain and similar imperial countries. So David Cameron's attempt at moral evasion is at best temporary. I think Europe understands it can't refuse to deal with this question. And luckily, many of the officials in other European Union countries are trying to deal with it.
It seems as though every week here in the United States, police in some corner of the country bring us a story on the killing of a black man. This week's story focuses on the city of Baltimore, Maryland, and the fatal shooting of a 25-year-old man named Freddie Gray. Gray died yesterday after being in coma for several days from injuries sustained after his arrest. Gray's family is demanding answers to the questions of why he was arrested in the first place and what took place during the arrest, in which 4 officers were involved. Gray was in perfect health until his arrest on April 12th. There's a 30-minute gap in the timeline of his arrest, and medical records show his spine was 80% severed at his neck. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave, and Baltimore police are planning a news conference today at which they may reveal more details. There are protests scheduled by family members and activists denouncing Freddie Gray's death. Well, Bob, you would think that the national attention being paid to the senseless police killings of black men would deter them, but it doesn't seem to have had any effect, does it?
Well, the police union in Baltimore cautions us against a rush to judgment, so don't rush, Sonali. But of course, there's now an incredible body of evidence around the country about this pattern. It doesn't mean, of course, every cop is a bad cop looking to shoot a young black man. It's a pattern we have to deal with. And it may be that there's a tipping point coming. a point at which so many of these cases pile up that there's going to have to be action. And then the question is what kind of action? And I think the most basic suggestion we might make is that the police not investigate themselves, that the district attorney, which typically works with the police, not be the prosecuting arm for these kind of cases, that we create a system in which there's real accountability, meaning outside prosecutions of these kind of cases.
And finally, it was 5 years ago today that the BP Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded off of the Gulf Coast of the United States, killing nearly a dozen oil workers and setting off one of the worst industrial disasters in the region. The BP spill emptied millions of gallons of crude oil into the ocean, which prompted the use of millions of gallons of dangerous dispersants, the effects of which are still unknown. Now, the Obama administration, which has championed offshore drilling, has proposed a new set of rules to address the serious risks involved in these types of operation. And among the rules are better use of technology and more safety inspections. There are several operations itching to proceed in Alaska and the southeastern shore of the U.S. The administration is inviting the public to comment on the proposed rules over 2 months. The LA Times reports that the oil industry is, quote, generally content with the new rules. Shouldn't we, Bob, be moving away entirely from offshore drilling?
Well, first of all, I must comment, I'm struck by my own emotional reaction as you were recounting the BP spill. A reminder that this was not simply an accident. This was a catastrophe. I remember Naomi Klein describing it as not an oil spill, but a hole in the world. And I think that's important to hold on to. If we do hold on to that, then we're going to realize that not just deep water drilling, but mountaintop removal for coal, fracking, and of course the tar sands, all of these forms of what are now called extreme energy are environmentally catastrophes. There's no way to do them safely. You can try to improve the rules, you can try and improve the technology, but the real question is, can we start thinking about a lower energy future? These are tied. If we can't think about a lower energy future, these resources are going to be exploited in incredibly dangerous ways. And that's why the question of how we live and how we drill are inexorably tied, I think.
Bob Jensen, thanks so much for joining us today. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin, sitting in for Rahul Mahajan. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A major investigative report released last week by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ, on the Huffington Post has found that projects funded by the World Bank have, over the past decade, displaced 3.4 million people worldwide. A conservation program in western Kenya, a gold mine in Peru, and a so-called villagization effort in Ethiopia are among the programs sponsored by the World Bank that have resulted in violent outcomes for ordinary people that include losing their homes. The report is a culmination of work by 50 journalists from more than 20 news organizations covering 14 countries. It concluded, among other things, that the World Bank, quote, regularly failed to live up to its own policies for protecting people harmed by projects it finances. On its website, the World Bank touts two goals that it has set for itself by the year 2030. First, to, quote, end extreme poverty by decreasing the percentage of people living on less than $1.25 a day to no more than 3%. And second, promote shared prosperity by fostering the income growth of the bottom 40% for every country. But the ICIJ report gives light to these goals. My guest is Sasha Chavkin. He is a reporter with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and the lead author of the report Evicted and Abandoned, the World Bank's Broken Promise to the Poor. He's also directly worked on the World Bank's Ethiopia project of villagization, which has displaced thousands of people. Welcome to Uprising, Sasha.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, first, how does it work? How does the bank approach various governments, or do governments approach the World Bank? Do they come up with a plan to do some sort of development that they decide is going to alleviate poverty, and then just simply proceed with getting a World Bank loan to finance that development?
Formally, it's governments that approach bank with ideas for projects, although they both work together closely to develop them. Ideas for projects then have to be approved by the bank board in order for the money to be loaned out. And in addition to governments, the bank also gives money to companies through its private sector loan arm, the International Finance Corporation.
And so I'm assuming that the bank signs off on the loans with guarantees that it will actually benefit and not harm people, since its goal is to end extreme poverty, in the words of the bank. In your report, you quote Naveen Rai, a former World Bank official, who says that the bank routinely does not follow up to ensure that the projects that it funds actually benefits the people. Can you comment on that?
Right. So bank own rules is obliged to find out that its projects are complying with its social and environmental safeguards. Projects have the borrowers, the governments that are getting money from
Sasha,
the
we're going to call you on your phone and keep your video up because we're having trouble hearing you. So we'll get your audio via phone. So we're going to try calling you right now on the phone, since we're having trouble hearing you. So so that our audience can hear your answers a little bit more clearly. And actually, in the meantime, I also want to point our audience to the investigative report's results, the entire report itself, along with very sophisticated interactive web links that's available on a special section of the Huffington Post. The report is entitled Evicted and Abandoned and can be found at the Huffington Post's website, and along with a map where the audience can click on countries to find out what projects the World Bank has financed in those particular areas, and the impacts that have sort of gone against the mission of the World Bank to end extreme poverty, and has instead displaced people. It's a remarkable report that isn't being paid much attention to. Again, the name of the report is Evicted and Abandoned: The World Bank's Broken Promise to the Poor. And my guest, Sasha Chavkin, is the lead author of that report, and he has led a number of journalists, something like 50 journalists across 20 countries. We're going to try to get Sasha on the phone. In the meantime, we'll just take a short break while we try to get him. Do bear with us, but this report is very much worth listening to, listening about and hearing about and watching, so don't go away. We'll be right back. And we have Sasha Chavkin on the phone with us. He is a reporter with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and the lead author of the report Evicted and Abandoned: The World Bank's Broken Promise to the Poor. Hi, Sasha.
Hi, good to be back on again.
Yeah, so you were saying that that there seems to be a serious problem with the World Bank not really following up on the projects that it sponsors and checking to see if the projects that it has given funds for is actually doing more good than harm.
Right. So as I was saying, the bank has an obligation to check that all of its social and environmental protections are followed, and included in that, it's actually supposed to ensure that people who are displaced are going to be resettled under equal or better conditions. What we found is that our documentation, the bank's documentation of that is incredibly incomplete, and that there frequently is very little follow-up on whether that rule is actually complied with.
So this number that you and other journalists found is quite remarkable. 3.4 million people displaced between 2004 and 2013. Let's turn to the reasons why these displacements are happening. I mean, this is just a huge number. And what do you mean by the word displaced? When we hear the word displaced, it might sound a little euphemistic, but what does it really mean? It can be quite violent, right?
Right. So displacement can refer to one of three things. It can mean people who are evicted from their homes, essentially, and have to abandon the place where they're living. It can be people who lose some or all of their land, and it can be people whose livelihoods are damaged by projects. So all of those kinds of harms are included within displacement. Again, the bank is supposed to be restoring everyone who's affected that way to equal or better conditions, but what we found is that frequently that's not what's happening.
So let's turn to one example of displacement. Let's talk about Ethiopia, so-called villagization effort. The Ethiopian government took a loan from the World Bank, and then essentially it was found that some of those funds were diverted, possibly illegally or at least without full oversight. And it ended up that the Ethiopian government began resettling people into these villages, saying that they would get better services. What actually happened?
Right. So the Ethiopian government came up with a program called villagization. And what villagization promised to do was take isolated rural people and move them into government villages where they were supposed to get clinics and schools and clean water and better services. It turned out that that isn't what happened, that the services weren't delivered, and their relocations turned out to be forcible. And were imposed by the government and by Ethiopian soldiers.
And these are indigenous people. It's a group of indigenous people called the Anuak. They haven't just lost their homes, though, right? Tell us about the beatings and the arrests, the intimidation, and even the rapes.
So I spoke with Anuak refugees who are in a camp in South Sudan. They actually fled into South Sudan despite the civil war going on there because they faced such violence in Ethiopia. I spoke to a man who described being beaten within inches of his life, women who described being raped. And in fact, I even spoke with the former governor of the Ethiopian state where these evictions occurred, who acknowledged to me that there was violence and intimidation involved with the villagization program.
And so these are people who are indigenous communities that were essentially told by the government that they have to move into these formal villages, forced into these villages, and all of this financed by the World Bank. The World Bank is patting itself on the back, saying that it's working to alleviate poverty. How is it allowing this to happen?
Well, to be clear, the World Bank is giving money for a nationwide health and education program in Ethiopia called Protecting Basic Services, which is funding schools and hospitals and all kinds of good stuff across Ethiopia. The thing is that the money that is supposed to be going into that program is being diverted by Ethiopian federal authorities into this forcible relocation program. And so no one is suggesting that the bank wants this to happen, but the bank is warned over and over by Anuak refugees, by human rights groups, and by others that this is happening, and it refuses to listen to those warnings and instead continues to give hundreds of millions of dollars to the same program.
Now, I understand that the bank has both denied that there have been specific problems, but then accepted that there might have been some problems with some of the projects that it funded. In your Ethiopia report, you said that the World Bank's country program coordinator for Ethiopia, Greg Tumlin, said, quote, "We are confident that the money was used for the purposes intended. We remain confident there was no link with reports of abuse." So on the one hand, they seem to be denying it, but then when confronted with the fact that the organization ought to be checking up on the projects that it funds, he said, we're not in the physical security business, implying that the bank can't police how their funds are used. Is this a cop-out?
Well, what the bank says is that they're blamed for unrelated abuses by governments that borrow from them. They say that they're an organization that has high standards for protecting people, and particularly for protecting people who are displaced. So when there's a problem somewhere else, people try to blame the bank because they think the bank is more likely to help them get compensation. The issue, though, is how the World Bank's money is being used. And in the case of Ethiopia, a number of former Ethiopian officials have said that the bank's money itself was used for this violent eviction program. So the real question is, how is the World Bank's money itself being spent by these borrowers, and what is the bank doing to check how its money is being spent?
Now, you say in your Ethiopia report that the evictions in Ethiopia fit a larger pattern. Communities displaced amid World Bank group projects in Nigeria, Honduras, Kenya, Indonesia, India, Guatemala, and Uganda have accused the organization's borrowers of committing human rights violations. Is there a pattern to the displacement and the abuses all over the world from World Bank funded projects? I'm assuming the answer to that is yes, which is why you and your fellow investigative reporters did this report.
So over and over again, we found examples of communities describing serious human rights violations connected with World Bank projects. In Kenya, there were indigenous people who described having their homes burned to the ground as they were evicted from ancestral forests. In Honduras, there were peasants involved in a land conflict with a company financed by the World Bank's private sector lender, who said that dozens of members of peasant groups were murdered by security guards connected to the World Bank's client. There are very serious allegations that are out there in case after case, and what we found is that repeatedly the bank is continuing to lend to many of these clients even after the allegations emerge.
Now, I understand that the World Bank president, Jim Yong Kim, responded to the report and said, we took a hard look at ourselves on resettlement, and what we found caused me deep concern. Are they acknowledging that there are problems finally, particularly maybe prompted by your report?
The World Bank has admitted that they have serious problems with resettlement, and they say that they have a plan to fix those problems, which Jim Kim himself announced when he made that statement in March. The bank claims that it is acting based on its own internal reports. However, the timeline is that they made this announcement 5 days after we sent a set of detailed questions to the bank in which we told them that we had identified systemic gaps in their resettlement practices, and that in fact we had been leaked one of the internal reports that the bank released 5 days later. So we'll leave it for your listeners to judge what happened, but that's the order of events.
Well, certainly there is great power in investigative journalism to affect positive change. The report is extremely ambitious, clearly was the result of collaboration of a lot of people and institutions. How did it all begin? Where did this report's origin start, and how can people best explore the work? Because there is a lot to explore.
Well, one of the things that really caught my attention was just all of these complaints I found from communities that were describing, as I told you before, serious human rights abuses involved with evictions, and in many cases, just thousands and thousands of people being forcibly resettled from their land. One great way for people to explore the project is first to go to the project's website at huff.to/worldbank, and then also to specifically look at our interactive database where we have compiled all the information the World Bank was not keeping track of very closely, and you can now search by country, by economic sector, and look in detail at all the projects that are displacing people, how many people are being displaced in them, and how it may affect your country or the industry that you particularly are focused on researching.
That's huff.po/World Bank. I want to thank you so much, Sasha, for joining us today, and best of luck to you.
Thank you for having me.
And for those of you who missed the link, we'll post it to uprisingwithsonali.com later today. Sasha Chavkin is my guest. He's a reporter with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, lead author of the report we've just been discussing, Evicted and Abandoned, the World Bank's Broken Promise to the Poor. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show as well as a radio show? You can watch this show on Free Speech TV, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel for a very small monthly fee, which helps us sustain the costs of TV production. Find out more at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Republicans and Democrats put aside their differences last week to hand over power to the president. It's an unusual move until you consider the issue at stake, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the massive and secretive trade agreement that is opposed by a broad coalition of labor, student, and activist groups, has been all but cleared by Congress for so-called fast-track legislation. That means the president would have the authority to negotiate trade deals like the TPP and present them to Congress for only a yes or no vote without amendments. Republican Senator Orrin Hatch justified the move, saying, quote, "It's important for America, it's important for the world that we get this done." One of the few senators opposing fast track, Sherrod Brown, called it, however, a complete abdication of our responsibilities. TPP is considered NAFTA on steroids. Organizations around the country are scrambling to urge their representatives to vote no on fast-track authority, saying that TPP will make human rights, labor laws, and environmental standards subservient to corporate profits. Over the weekend, the AFL-CIO spearheaded a national Stop Fast Track Day of action. Joining me now is Patrick Woodall, Research Director and Senior Policy Advocate for Food and Water Watch, Public Policy Analyst, Researcher, and Advocate on Economic Justice Issues in Washington, and co-author of a book on the World Trade Organization. Patrick had been on Uprising only a couple of weeks ago to discuss the details of a TPP chapter that had leaked. Welcome back to the show, Patrick.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Now, can you explain for a layperson what fast-track authority actually means? I tried to explain it, I think, but it might be worth really getting it straight. Does it essentially mean that Congress is giving up its authority to have input on this major deal?
Absolutely. It's a total abdication of congressional authority over international commercial agreements. The Constitution gives Congress the exclusive authority to negotiate the terms and set the terms of commercial agreements. Fast track is a Nixonian plan that actually forces Congress to surrender that authority and only vote up or down, and on a very accelerated timetable on a trade deal that will be thousands of pages long. So really what should happen is Congress should be setting kind of binding negotiating goals. They should be able to ensure that those goals are met in the negotiations, and there should be steps along the way for strong congressional enforceable binding input on the negotiations. This would kind of sidestep all of that and let the president choose the partners, choose the terms of the deal, and then present it for an up or down, take it or leave it vote to the Congress.
Why would Congress want to abdicate its responsibility? I mean, it just seems bizarre if you look at the pattern and practice of particularly Republican politicking since President Obama has been in power. This seems to be, at least on the surface, going against their usual practice.
And in fact, fast track is sort of an anomaly. There's only been fast track for a little while during the last 25 years. The beginning of the kind of Bush, the end of the first Bush administration, the beginning of the first Clinton administration, and then in the beginning of Bush 2, there was fast track. But generally, there have been a ton of trade deals that have passed without fast track, and it's not required to do it. The argument they make is that it forces countries to make their best negotiating offer because they don't think the Congress will meddle with the process. So they argue that it is easier to get the best deal with fast track. But the reality is that if Congress had been part of this process all along, we could be negotiating for a trade deal that would work not just for big business, which is what this deal is designed for, but for working families, for the environment, for public health, for consumer protections.
Now, Patrick, Senator Orrin Hatch and Representative Paul Ryan, both of whom are Republicans, were pushing fast track, but they worked with Democratic Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. I mean, Orrin Hatch and Paul Ryan, I can understand, they're Republicans, but Ron Wyden has been characterized as a hardcore liberal. He joined the Republicans, for example, during a filibuster to oppose John Brennan as CIA director. So he has joined the Republicans in the past. But on this issue of secrecy in that matter, he said it comes down to every American has the right to know when their government believes that it is allowed to kill them. Well, some might argue the TPP could very well damage Americans, if not kill us. Why is Wyden pushing for the secret trade deal?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that, sort of the leadership on the Senate Finance Committee is really only given to people that are willing to be pro-trade. So it really is a core tenet of being part of that committee. There are a lot of pro-trade people on both sides of the aisle on that committee. The second is there's intense pressure both from the White House but also from the big business community to actually get a bipartisan support for this. The White House needs there to be at least the patina of bipartisanship for a deal that almost all Democrats oppose pretty vehemently, and obviously many Republicans are going to oppose it as well. So they wanted to present a more bipartisan deal for this. So Wyden extracted some minor concessions, really window dressing on things like transparency that will ultimately have no real effect. And instead, we have pretty much the same old fast track that we had in 2002 and in 1991. So that's the pressure that is on all members of Congress, but it comes down especially hard on Senator Wyden, who is the ranking member on that committee.
Now, if fast track goes through, I'm assuming that Congress will know the details of this deal before they're allowed to vote up or down on it without being allowed to amend it. But when will we, the people, know the details of it?
Well, I think the final text of the deal will be made public really when the deal is introduced. So once the treaty is signed by the president, it would actually go to the Congress, and then there would be a short window, and we would see it. We would have ability to see it at that point. There are actually two pieces of the treaty. There is the treaty, it's not treaty, it's a commercial pact, not a treaty, but the TPP itself, as well as implementing legislation that would actually change any laws to bring them into conformity with the requirements on the TPP. So those would come together. So we would see that really when it was presented to Congress, and we would have a very brief, only months to look at it before it was considered by the Congress.
And we've discussed the details of the TPP a number of times on our show, including when we had you on to specifically discuss a one chapter. But how do you summarize this to the average American who's never heard of TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and how it could impact them? Because unfortunately, major media is not covering this as it should, and ordinary people who've never heard of the TPP probably have no clue that it could actually impact Americans on a day-to-day basis. Right?
Sure. I mean, there are a number of pretty obvious ways that it's going to impact people. The first is obviously that it could end up offshoring even more jobs, both in the manufacturing sector, but even in places like call centers and in the service industry, where these jobs could be shifted to places where there are cheaper workers, worse workplace protection, and weaker environmental standards. We discussed the investment provisions, which would allow foreign companies to challenge really common sense consumer, public health, and environmental protections, which could have effects on everybody's day-to-day life in terms of, there are huge food safety implications to this, which ultimately would mean that, we would live in a world, these issues could end up on our kitchen table as we imported more potentially tainted food from TPP nations with weaker oversight at the border. So there are real tangible effects on people, but it also has effects on things like access to generic medicines, because it will strengthen the patent regime and give the pharmaceutical industry longer patent terms. And that means it'll take longer for generic meds to get onto the market. It means it's going to cost people more money. So there are a lot of very day-to-day issues that'll affect people. It's not a kind of a theoretical problem. It's one that will affect people almost immediately.
Now, the AFL-CIO announced that as soon as Congress introduces fast track, the labor union will launch a massive six-figure advertising campaign to pressure 16 senators and 36 members of Congress to oppose fast track. The campaign is planned to run through August. It will begin with digital ads, may expand into TV, radio, and newspaper. How important is it for organized labor to stop this, and can they?
Well, I think it's very important for organized labor to stop this, and they're super committed to doing so. This is a really powerful moment in the labor movement. First, all the presidents of all of the organized labor in the country have signed a letter saying they are opposed to it. So a very unified front amongst organized labor. Second, all of the labor unions are withholding political donations until they see how people vote on fast track. That sends a powerful message to the Congress that this is a key issue for them. And obviously, workers care a great deal about this because they understand fundamentally that TPP will do the same thing that NAFTA did, empower the business owners to move their jobs overseas, will exert downwards pressure on wages, it exacerbates income inequality, and is used to crack unions. So there are obviously lots of reasons for workers to be opposed to this. This is a powerful part of the broad-based coalition that is operating today to stop fast track. It includes most of the environmental community. It includes consumer groups like Food and Water Watch. It includes public health groups concerned about the access to essential medicines and generics, and lots of people that are concerned about the impact it can have on local governance and sovereignty issues. So there's a broad-based coalition that's working very hard to stop fast track.
Now, what should we expect from the pro-free traders about the beautiful things that will arrive on the shores of the U.S. if the TPP were to pass and become the law of the land? How are they selling this to Americans?
Well, they sell it a number of ways. One is by just essentially being fairly deceptive, right? So they say that there'll be all these new jobs because of exports, but they never talk about the jobs that are lost here because of more imports. And that's been the experience with every trade deal that we've had to date, that the increase in imports vastly exceeds the export increase, and that actually hurts the number of workers here and lowers wages, as I said. They will also say that it's very important geopolitically because they're using this because if we don't set the rules, then China will set the rules. So they make this argument as part of this Asia pivot that the president has promoted, and they're trotting out hosts of the kind of graybeards in both sides of the aisle to promote this as important for U.S. foreign policy, which is really the silliest argument that I've heard. I mean, there's no risk that we're going to have worse relations with Australia or Singapore because we don't have the TPP. It's not like Japan will no longer be our friend if we don't sign the TPP. So, I mean, they're going to make a ton of arguments that are largely deceptive. And people know, right? They have experience with what happened with NAFTA. It's lost jobs, more dangerous imported produce, and those problems are just going to be expanded with the TPP.
And finally, Patrick, there were major protests in Europe over the weekend over not the TPP, but the TTIP, not to be confused with the TPP. TPP is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This is a free trade agreement currently being negotiated between the European Union and the United States. It's not getting very much attention. Europeans, at least those who marched over the weekend, seem to be against it. Is this something we need to be paying attention to as well?
We absolutely need to pay attention to it. And I will say the negotiations are not as far along as the TPP negotiations, which is why there's somewhat less attention to it. The fast track bill that was introduced this week is designed to cover TPP as well as the TTIP.
I see.
And it's important to realize that they're kind of very important but somewhat different issues with the TTIP. I mean, obviously the key issue with Europe is one not of the kind of as much on the tariff side, but much more on the regulatory side. So it's really an opportunity for the Wall Street fat cats to kind of do an end run against the regulations designed to address the economic collapse in Dodd-Frank and their counterparts in Europe that are trying to do the same thing with rules there to stop kind of rampant deregulation on the financial services side. So those kind of things are key issues in the TTIP that are less common in the TPP negotiations. But those kind of regulatory issues really demonstrate what this is all about, because it's not about the kind of old school trade agreements that are about tariffs and quotas. It's really about giving the big businesses an opportunity to do a sneak attack on the kind of regulatory safeguards across the board that we use to protect consumers from economic collapse and dangerous food and dangerous products. Those are the kind of regulatory coherence arguments that are being used in these secret negotiations to kind of unravel the protections we've built up over decades.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us. We'll be staying on top of this story and letting our audience know what happens with Fast Track Authority in particular. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Patrick Woodall is a research director and senior policy advocate for Food and Water Watch, and he writes about these issues that we've been discussing as well. You can read his writings from a link that we'll post to uprisingwithsonali.com. This is Uprising. After this short break, we'll find out why tipped workers are being left out of the fight for higher minimum wage. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. If you've done a lot of traveling outside the United States, one of the differences that might jump out at you when you eat out or travel by taxi is that the culture of tipping people for services varies dramatically. For example, in Japan, tips are not only uncommon, they're considered insulting. In some countries like Germany, it is considered obligatory to tip regardless of the service. In places like Italy, restaurants put a cover charge on your bill in lieu of requiring a tip. Here in the United States, it's considered customary to tip at least 15% of your bill, but only if you've gotten good service. If you're really impressed, 20% is the norm. It's a curious custom, perhaps one that grew out of the personal responsibility mantra in the U.S. But what is curiouser is that it places the onus of payment onto the customer twice. You pay a company for service, and then you pay the worker you deal with what the company won't pay them. Such a system not only makes workers subservient to the whims of customers, but also allows companies to exempt themselves from paying a living wage. Tipped workers are often singled out for lower minimum wages than other workers. Recently, the Minnesota House passed a bill to lower the hourly wage of tipped workers to only $8 an hour, succumbing to the restaurant industry's lobbying. Nebraska rejected a bill that would have raised the wage for tipped workers to the same levels of other workers. And in California, there's a proposal to freeze the wages of tipped workers to $9 an hour if the minimum wage is increased to $13. My guest is Sophia Cheng, community organizer with the Restaurant Opportunity Center for Los Angeles, and Zumi Mizukami, a member of ROC who's had 10 years of experience in the restaurant industry. Welcome to Uprising, Sophia and Zumi. Well, let me ask you first to explain, how did we even get in this situation, Sophia? I mean, I sort of mentioned the various countries. Who decides how much to tip and why? You know, we tip wait staff at a restaurant, but we don't tip grocery store clerks or cashiers unless they help us with our bags. And even then, we're not sure. We tip hairdressers and car washers, but we don't tip gardeners or parking lot attendants, or do we? We tip valets and doormen, but we don't tip concierges. Who decides who gets tipped and why? Who decides whose wages should remain low because they're not getting tipped?
Thank you, Sonali, for having us on the show. And like you pointed out, the tipped workforce is a really diverse workforce. Here in Los Angeles, you know, 56% of the tipped workforce is actually outside of the restaurant industry. And like you said, a lot of those are service jobs like hairdressers, car wash workers, hospitality people, people who clean. You know, California is one of the few states that has just one fair wage, one minimum wage for all workers. And in other states in the U.S., 43 states, there's a tipped minimum wage. It's a sub-minimum wage for people who are tipped workers. And it's really the corporate restaurant lobby that has kept the tip minimum wage, the federal tip minimum wage, frozen at $2.13.
So in California now, they want to create this two-tier system, right, where there is a pressure to raise the wages of workers, but the restaurant industry wants to freeze the wages of tipped workers. Zumi, can you tell us first a little bit about your experience in the restaurant industry? And is it really true that tipped workers, as those in the restaurant industry claim, are getting well above $9 an hour, even more than $15 an hour, because of all the tips that are apparently flowing into your pockets?
Thank you. Well, there's a lot of misconceptions about tipped workers, and I think that folks that are representing the restaurant industry as owners often are saying that tipped workers are making $30, $40, $50 an hour because of their tips, which could be true for some people, but I think that that's a really small percentage of servers or of restaurant workers.
So if you are working in the very high-end restaurants, and if you're counting just the lunch hours, maybe when there's lots of people, and if you have a certain kind of clientele, then you might at certain times be getting $30, $40 an hour?
Yeah, and I think that to get those jobs in fine dining restaurants, you have to fit a certain profile, and that's racial and that's gendered as well. So in the U.S., if you're going to be serving at a fine dining restaurant and you're going to be considered for that kind of position, then you need to fit that profile. You need to be white and male and look very clean, and you have to be able to portray what that clientele is going to.
And the rest of the majority of tipped workers certainly don't, you're saying, have that sort of wage when you account for tips.
Yeah.
And tell us about your own experience in the restaurant industry.
Okay, sure. So I've been working in the restaurant for about 10 years and in various positions in the back of house and the front of house. And as a tipped worker, I know that we share our tips as well in many of the establishments that we work for. So it's not just that person who's putting down the plate that actually gets your tip. It's actually the back of house, it's the busser, it's the runner, it's the bartender. Yeah, and I think that you mentioned it a little bit earlier that we are also subsidizing our wage with the tips. So as a front of house worker, if you're tipping out and you're sharing your tips with the cooks and with the chefs, then you're also helping them make more money because they're making a very low wage to begin with.
And Sophia, the issue of who's subsidizing these wages also comes into play when we look at the fact that many of the tipped workers in the industry around the country, and even probably in California where this program is paid, are getting public assistance, right? I mean, we know Walmart workers get a lot of public assistance because they're paid so little, but what about tipped workers? Is the public also subsidizing the industries that use tipped workers?
That's absolutely right, because just looking at Los Angeles, it's a very expensive city to live in. I think, you know, there was a recent estimate that the average person living in LA needs to make $33 an hour just to be able to afford rent and basic necessities. And according to census data, 70% of servers in LA make less than 24,000. So it's definitely not a living wage. When folks are not getting a living wage, then there's dependence on basically the public through taxpayers to survive. And Rock LA, where we're from, is part of a national organization, Rock United. You can check out rockunited.org. We just came out with a report about basically across the nation the amount that taxpayers are subsidizing the wages, the low wages of restaurant workers.
Rush Limbaugh on Fox News recently made a big deal about Hillary Clinton not leaving a tip at a Chipotle when she went there in Ohio recently, one of the branches there, and they're saying that if she really cared about working people, she would have left a tip. But others are saying she didn't need to tip because there's no table service at a place like Chipotle. Is that the wrong conversation that we need to be having? I mean, it's like we're focusing on, forgetting about the fact for a moment that it's Hillary Clinton. We're focusing on the customer rather than the industry, rather than the employee, right? Employer, rather.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in on this, and then maybe Zumi can add too. But I think the main point is that everybody needs a living wage, and a minimum wage, there's a reason it's called a minimum wage, because it's a minimum standard. And I think the point is nobody should be working and living in poverty. And so, in California, $9, even $15 wouldn't really be enough. When you look at other states, the fact that people are getting paid between $2 and $3, is really not acceptable. And so we feel that it is the responsibility of employers to pay their employees, and it shouldn't matter, for if the tip is there.
Right. So federally, there's a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, and we should clarify this. So in states where there is no minimum wage or no minimum wage higher than $7.25, people are getting a base rate of $7.25. But tipped workers in those states are getting something like $2 to $3 an hour, which this is just unbelievable to think about that. So unless they happen to live in a state where tipped workers specifically are getting a certain minimum wage, they're getting even below the federal minimum wage. How are tipped workers participating in the Fight for 15 campaign that we've been seeing around the country? Is there solidarity from other workers? Are people recognizing across the industry that tipped workers in particular need to also demand and get higher wages?
Yes, a lot of people are spending a lot of energy fighting for a higher wage in multiple industries, and we're seeing a lot of similarities in our industries. One thing is that a lot of low-wage workers are experiencing wage theft, and it's because we're seen as disposable, and we're seen as being low-skilled or no-skilled, which is untrue. So wage theft meaning that our wages are often stolen from us in very sly ways. And I think that the reason that tips are such a big conversation right now is kind of also in conjunction with the fact that we're not making minimum wage even when we have a minimum wage, because a lot of times people's wages are being stolen from them. So.
Right. Now, Sophia, we usually think of the restaurant industry when we talk about tipped workers, but what about car washers and nail salon workers, other low-wage tipped workers? How serious is the situation there too?
I'm really glad you asked that. Like I mentioned before, 56% of the tipped workforce in Los Angeles is outside of the restaurant industry. And these are not only low-wage jobs, these are, like Zumi mentioned, very racialized and gendered jobs. So for example, the majority of the tipped workforce, both nationally and in Los Angeles, are women. And so creating a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers would actually be really, institutionalizing, making permanent this wage gap. And there's also
between
a lot of
men and women.
Exactly. And there's also a lot of harassment we know in tipped work. And so, for example, just the restaurant industry, it has 5 times the rate of sexual harassment claims as any other industry.
And this is something we shouldn't be surprised by. When you put the discretion of paying part of the wage onto the customer, and you create a power dynamic between the customer and the worker, you're going to have abuse. I mean, you're going to have abusive men expecting women workers to earn, quote unquote, their tips. You're going to see this happen. I mean, it's just inevitable. So let me ask both of you this question. Would we like to live in a world where we never have to tip because the workers are paid so well it never becomes an issue, and the cost of the salaries are built into the products that people are buying? I would rather pay more for a cup of coffee and not have to worry about tipping because I know that the worker who's made my coffee is being paid a living wage. Would you rather have that world?
Yeah, I think I would, but it would be so complicated to reach that world. And
But it's so complicated now.
it is really complicated right now. Yeah, it is really complicated right now, especially because we're dealing with an industry that the workers are experiencing a lot of theft from their wages.
Yeah.
So I think as a consumer, many people think, okay, if I tip well, then other people are tipping well. But the reality is a lot of people don't tip, especially if you're talking about restaurants or establishments that are in more working class neighborhoods. It's different. You know, our mindset around money is different, and it's difficult to really depend on a tip because they're unpredictable, and depending on the consumer, it's up to them. You know.
Sophia, do you have an opinion on this issue?
I think, you know, the statistic that we had mentioned earlier, that folks need really even over $30 an hour to survive in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. So we know that, you know, right now tips are a really important source of income for a lot of tipped workers.
And of course the industry is relying on that. They're saying that because of tips we can pay less. Anyway, that's certainly a conversation for a broader, there's a broader conversation to be had there about the need for tips. And it would be interesting to see how other countries handle, other countries where tipping isn't the norm, but people are paid well, and what all of that means. There was recently an action at a meeting of investors in New York by ROC organization, the national organization, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, where a number of activists disrupted an investors meeting. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the kinds of creative actions that workers are taking to draw attention to their issue?
Sure, absolutely. So when people find out that tipped workers in other states outside of California are making $2.13 an hour, people are really outraged. And there's a question about why is this happening? And a big part of it is because the corporate restaurant lobby, the National Restaurant Association, and here locally the California Restaurant Association is very strong. And it's made up of, you know, key companies such as the Applebee's of the world, and also Darden, which is the largest full-service restaurant corporation in the U.S. They own, for example, Olive Garden and Yard House. And so recently shareholders for Darden were in New York, and Darden workers and activists and organizers came together to interrupt the shareholders meeting to basically say, you know, we know what you're doing, and it's unacceptable. Every worker deserves a living wage.
And I should also mention there are, as I understand it, people who have been on a hunger strike outside the city hall in Los Angeles, a number of actions around the fight for 15. I want to thank the two of you so much for joining us today, and best of luck to you. And thank you for shedding light on how tipped workers are in danger of being left behind out of this very big fight. Thank you so much.
And if I can just add one thing, we were in Sacramento this past week, and so we saw the successful defeat of Assembly Bill 669, which would have introduced a tip minimum wage. So we're winning. We're trying to educate the public about the reality of tipped workers.
Thank you again, Sophia Cheng and Zumi Mizokami, both with the Restaurant Opportunity Center. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Bus is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Dan Swerdlove is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Kiana Turner are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kulharkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.